Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. This insight from Jung reveals why certain people trigger such intense reactions in us, and what those reactions are really telling us about ourselves. I learned this the hard way when I found myself seething with disgust at a colleague's desperate need for attention during meetings. The way he'd interrupt others, redirect conversations back to his achievements, perform this theatrical version of competence, it made my skin crawl. I felt morally superior, intellectually above his obvious insecurity. Then I caught myself doing exactly the same thing in a different context. Same desperate energy, same theatrical performance, just wrapped in different packaging. The person I judged most harshly was showing me a part of myself I'd refused to acknowledge. Jung spent decades mapping this psychological territory and discovered something that explains why we can spot manipulation in others while remaining blind to our own, why certain behaviors trigger us so intensely, and why our strongest moral judgments often reveal our deepest self-deceptions. This exploration will help you understand the hidden psychology behind your most intense reactions to others, and what those reactions are actually trying to teach you about yourself. Chapter 2: The Theater of Disowned Selves. We live in a culture of carefully curated authenticity. Scroll through social media and you'll see people performing vulnerability, competing over who can be more real, turning self-awareness into a brand. Everyone's a therapist, everyone's healing, everyone's on a journey, and everyone's quietly judging everyone else's version of growth. Nothing says authentic self-awareness like posting therapy insights while simultaneously judging everyone else's emotional processing in the comments. Have you ever noticed how quickly you can identify someone else's psychological patterns while remaining completely blind to your own? You see right through that person's people-pleasing, their need for validation, their subtle manipulation tactics. You watch them perform their persona and think, how exhausting it must be to be that fake. But here's what's fascinating. The traits that disgust us most in others are often the ones we've worked hardest to eliminate in ourselves. That colleague who desperately needs to be the smartest person in the room. You see it so clearly because you've felt that same desperate hunger for intellectual recognition. The friend who can't stop talking about their problems. You spot their victim mentality because you've wrestled with your own tendency to seek sympathy rather than solutions. Think of your psyche as running a sophisticated projection system, like a movie theater where instead of watching the screen, you mistake the projection for reality. Your mind constantly projects internal content onto external people, and most of the time, you're watching your own psychological movie playing on someone else's face. This projection system operates automatically. When you encounter someone displaying traits you've rejected in yourself, your unconscious mind lights up with recognition. But instead of seeing the connection, you experience revulsion. The stronger the judgment, the more likely you're seeing a disowned part of yourself. What's particularly disturbing is how this plays out in our therapeutic culture. We've become incredibly sophisticated at diagnosing other people's psychological patterns while maintaining complete blindness to our own. Someone's toxic, someone else is narcissistic, another person has abandonment issues. We've turned psychological insight into a weapon for maintaining our own sense of superiority. Have you ever caught yourself analyzing someone's behavior with the same intensity you avoid analyzing your own? The irony is exquisite. The more psychologically aware we become, the more skilled we get at using that awareness to avoid looking at ourselves. What might your strongest reactions to others be revealing about the parts of yourself you've refused to acknowledge? Chapter 3: Jung's Discovery of the Shadow. Carl Jung encountered this phenomenon first in his own life, then in his patients, and eventually recognized it as one of the fundamental mechanisms of human psychology. What he discovered was that every personality develops through a process of acceptance and rejection. We learn early what traits are valued and what traits are dangerous, then spend our lives building an identity around the acceptable parts, while banishing the unacceptable parts to what he called the shadow. Your shadow isn't just negative traits, it's everything about you that doesn't fit your conscious self-image. If you see yourself as kind, your shadow contains your capacity for cruelty. If you pride yourself on being rational, your shadow holds your irrationality. If you identify as humble, your shadow carries your grandiosity. Jung realized that these disowned parts don't disappear. They go underground, operating outside conscious awareness, but continuing to influence behavior. And one of the primary ways the shadow makes itself known is through projection. You see your own rejected traits playing out in other people, and you react with the intensity that comes from recognizing something deeply familiar, yet completely unacceptable. This creates what Jung called the psychological hook. When someone's behavior triggers an unusually strong emotional response in you, they've likely hooked into some shadow material. The person who annoys you by being too emotional is triggering your own rejected emotionality. The colleague whose ambition disgusts you is reflecting your own disowned drive for success. But Jung was honest about the limitations of this understanding. Shadow projection isn't the only reason we dislike people. Sometimes others genuinely behave badly, and healthy boundaries require us to recognize problematic behavior. The key distinction is intensity. When your reaction is disproportionate to the situation, when you feel a visceral disgust or moral superiority, when you can't stop thinking about how awful this person is, that's when you're likely seeing your own shadow. Isn't it fascinating how the people who trigger you most seem to represent a very specific trait, while others displaying similar behaviors barely register on your emotional radar? Jung also discovered that different cultures and historical periods create different shadow content. What your family, society, and era taught you to reject becomes the material your shadow is made of. This means your shadow is both deeply personal and culturally conditioned. It's your unique configuration of universal traits that your particular context deemed unacceptable. What makes Jung's framework particularly sophisticated is his recognition that shadow integration isn't about becoming these rejected traits. It's about acknowledging their existence within you. The goal isn't to become cruel if you've disowned your cruelty, but to recognize your capacity for cruelty so you can make conscious choices about how to channel that energy. Why do you think certain behaviors create such strong emotional reactions in you, while the same behaviors in different people leave you completely indifferent? Chapter 4. Advanced Shadow Recognition Techniques. The most sophisticated shadow work happens in real time, in the moment when you feel that familiar surge of moral disgust toward another person. Instead of indulging the judgment or trying to suppress it, you can use it as a diagnostic tool for self-discovery. When someone triggers intense dislike in you, ask yourself, what specifically am I judging about this person? Get precise. Is it their neediness, their arrogance, their victim mentality, their performative authenticity? Then ask the uncomfortable question, how do I do this same thing in my own life? The answer usually isn't obvious because you do the shadow trait in a different style than the person who triggered you. Maybe they're obviously needy and you're subtly needy. They might be blatantly arrogant while you're intellectually arrogant. They could be playing victim dramatically while you play victim through sophisticated psychological analysis of why life is unfair. Your projection system is like a sophisticated movie theater. It doesn't project random content onto others, it projects your own psychological material. When you encounter someone displaying traits you've rejected in yourself, your unconscious mind lights up with recognition, but instead of seeing the connection, you experience revulsion. The stronger the judgment, the more likely you're seeing a disowned part of yourself. This creates opportunities for what Jung called active imagination. Instead of letting projections run automatically, you can consciously work with them. When you notice intense judgment arising, pause and ask, what if this person is showing me something about myself that I need to understand? Sometimes the connection becomes immediately obvious. Other times it requires deeper investigation. You might discover that your disgust with someone's people-pleasing reflects your own covert contracts, the ways you give to others while secretly expecting reciprocation. Your irritation with someone's intellectual arrogance might reveal your own subtle ways of using knowledge to feel superior. Have you ever noticed how your most intense judgments often involve behaviors you've seen yourself do, just packaged differently? The most advanced technique is learning to hold the paradox. You can simultaneously recognize genuine problematic behavior in others and acknowledge how their behavior reflects something within you. This isn't about excusing harmful actions or losing your capacity for discernment. It's about using every human encounter as an opportunity for self-knowledge. What might your most intense judgments be protecting you from seeing about your own behavioral patterns? Chapter 5. The Cultural Shadow Theater. Shadow projection doesn't just happen between individuals. Entire cultures project their collective shadow onto other groups, other nations, other ideologies. What we're witnessing in our current political polarization is mass shadow projection on an unprecedented scale. Each political tribe has identified the other as carrying everything they've disowned about themselves. Conservatives project their capacity for authoritarianism onto liberals. Liberals project their capacity for moral superiority onto conservatives. Both sides are absolutely convinced the other represents everything wrong with humanity, while remaining blind to how they embody the very traits they condemn. We've somehow created a culture where everyone's a psychological expert about everyone except themselves. Fascinating how that works. Social media has turned this cultural projection theater into a 24/7 performance. We curate our online identities to represent our idealized selves, then scroll through feeds looking for people to judge. The algorithm learns what triggers your moral outrage and feeds you an endless stream of people behaving in ways that confirm your sense of superiority. Think about how this plays out in dating culture. Dating apps have created a marketplace where everyone's performing their best self while secretly judging everyone else's performance. You swipe left on people whose neediness shows too obviously, whose try-hard energy is too transparent, whose desperation for connection is too visible. Meanwhile, you're engaging in the exact same behaviors, just with better packaging. The corporate world has become another theater for shadow projection. Everyone complains about toxic workplace culture while contributing to the very dynamics they condemn. You judge your co-workers' brown-nosing while engaging in your own sophisticated forms of political maneuvering. You roll your eyes at the boss's ego while carefully managing your own image and reputation. Even the self-help and spiritual communities aren't immune. There's a particularly insidious form of shadow projection that happens around awakening and consciousness. People who pride themselves on being spiritually evolved often carry tremendous shadow around their own ego drives, their need for specialness, their judgmental nature. The more enlightened you claim to be, the more shadow material you're likely projecting onto those you deem unconscious. Have you ever noticed how the most conscious people often seem to have the strongest opinions about everyone else's level of awareness? Jung understood that healthy societies require institutions and rituals for acknowledging and integrating collective shadow material. Without these mechanisms, the shadow gets projected onto scapegoats, minority groups, foreign enemies, political opponents, who carry the burden of everything the dominant culture refuses to acknowledge about itself. When entire cultures share the same projections, we get collective movies that everyone mistakes for reality. The other political party isn't just wrong, they're evil. The other country isn't just different, they're a threat to everything good. The other generation isn't just making different choices, they're destroying civilization. Why do you think certain behaviors in others create such strong reactions in you, while the same behaviors in different contexts barely register? Chapter 6. The uncomfortable truth about moral superiority. Here's what most people don't want to hear. Your capacity for moral outrage is often proportional to your capacity for self-deception. The more intensely you judge others, the more likely you are to engage in sophisticated forms of the same behaviors while remaining completely unconscious of your own patterns. This is particularly true for intelligent, psychologically aware people who've learned to recognize problematic behaviors in others. The same intelligence that makes you skilled at diagnosing other people's issues can become a weapon for avoiding your own self-examination. You see someone's manipulation tactics so clearly, you analyze their psychological patterns so accurately, you understand their unconscious motivations so completely, and you use this insight to maintain your sense of being above such behaviors. We've mastered the art of seeing everyone else's flaws in high definition while our own blind spots remain conveniently invisible. It's like having 20/20 vision for judging others and complete myopia for self-reflection. But Jung discovered something that makes this even more complex. Sometimes the traits you judge most harshly in others are actually qualities you need to develop in yourself. If you're disgusted by someone's selfishness, you might need to learn healthy selfishness. If their boundary setting triggers you, you might need to develop your own capacity to say no. If their ambition offends you, you might be disowning your own legitimate desires for achievement. The shadow isn't just about negative traits. It contains everything that doesn't fit your conscious self-image, including positive qualities that were trained out of you early in life. If you were taught that anger was dangerous, your shadow might contain healthy assertiveness. If showing off was forbidden, your shadow might hold your natural confidence and playfulness. This means that some of your moral judgments are actually rejecting qualities that would make you more whole, more effective, more authentically yourself. The person whose confidence you find arrogant might be demonstrating self-assurance you were never allowed to develop. The individual whose emotional expression seems too much might be showing you feelings you learned to suppress. Have you ever found yourself criticizing someone for a quality that, if you're honest, you secretly wish you had more of? What's particularly sophisticated about Jung's understanding is that he recognized the shadow as containing not just individual rejected material, but also collective wisdom that cultures have disowned. In our therapeutic age, we've largely rejected traits like healthy aggression, competitive drive, tribal loyalty, and protective instincts. And then we wonder why people feel so disconnected from their power and purpose. The uncomfortable truth is that moral superiority often masks a deep fear of your own capacity for the behaviors you judge. The person who's most disgusted by others' greed is often terrified of their own materialistic desires. The individual who can't stand fake people is usually running from their own performative tendencies. The one who judges others' neediness most harshly is typically most afraid of their own dependency. Jung insisted that real psychological development requires what he called holding the opposites, acknowledging that you contain both the capacity for great good and great harm, that you're capable of both generosity and selfishness, both wisdom and foolishness. The goal isn't to become perfect, but to become conscious of your full psychological range so you can make deliberate choices about how to channel your energy. What if your strongest moral judgments are actually roadmaps to the parts of yourself you most need to understand and integrate? Chapter 7. Integration and the End of Projection. The honest truth about shadow work is that it's never complete. You don't finish integrating your shadow and graduate to some enlightened state where you never project onto others again. What changes is your relationship with the process. You become more curious about your judgments, more suspicious of your moral certainty, more interested in what your reactions are teaching you about yourself. I still catch myself in shadow projections regularly. Last week, I found myself irritated by someone's obvious hunger for intellectual validation, then realized I was doing the exact same thing in that very moment, just more subtly. The difference now is that I recognize the pattern faster, and instead of indulging the judgment, I get curious about what it's revealing. This is what Jung meant by making the unconscious conscious. Not achieving some perfect state of awareness, but developing the capacity to catch yourself in the act of self-deception. The goal isn't to stop having a shadow, but to recognize when your shadow is operating so you can choose how to respond rather than react automatically. What's particularly challenging about this work is that it requires holding multiple paradoxes simultaneously. You need to acknowledge your capacity for the behaviors you judge while still maintaining healthy discernment about others' actions. You need to own your projections without losing your ability to recognize genuine problematic behavior. You need to integrate your shadow material without becoming the traits you've rejected. The practical application looks like this. When someone triggers intense judgment in you, use it as information rather than justification. Ask yourself what you're seeing in them that you've disowned in yourself. Look for how you might engage in similar behaviors with different packaging. Consider whether the trait you're judging might actually be something you need to develop in a healthy way. But here's what I've learned that Jung didn't emphasize enough. This work requires tremendous compassion for your own psychological complexity. The shadow contains parts of you that developed for good reasons: survival mechanisms, protective strategies, adaptations to difficult circumstances. Integrating these parts doesn't mean condemning them, but understanding their purpose and choosing consciously when and how to express them. The ultimate irony of shadow work is that the more you acknowledge your own capacity for the behaviors you judge, the less you need to judge them in others. When you accept your own potential for manipulation, you can recognize it in others without moral outrage. When you own your own neediness, you can see it in others with compassion rather than disgust. This doesn't mean losing your boundaries or becoming naive about human nature. If anything, it makes you more perceptive because you're not using emotional energy to maintain illusions about your own superiority. You can see clearly what's happening in relationships and situations because you're not invested in being right about other people being wrong. Jung believed that individuals who do this work contribute to the psychological health of the collective. When you stop projecting your shadow onto others, you're no longer contributing to the cultural dynamics of scapegoating and othering that create so much unnecessary conflict in our world. Your journey toward greater self-awareness, including the uncomfortable recognition of your own psychological complexity, is actually a gift to everyone you encounter. When you stop needing others to carry your disowned traits, you free them to be more authentically themselves, and you free yourself to engage with reality rather than your projections of it. The question isn't whether you have a shadow or whether you project. You do, and you will continue to. The question is whether you're willing to get curious about what your strongest reactions to others are trying to teach you about yourself. I'm curious, what patterns are you starting to recognize in your own judgment tendencies? What reactions have you had that might be worth examining more closely? Share your insights in the comments below. This community understands the complexity and discomfort of this work. If you found this exploration valuable, subscribe to Keys to the Psyche for more deep dives into the psychological patterns that shape our lives. We're building a community of thoughtful people committed to understanding themselves and the world more clearly. And that understanding always begins with the courage to look in the mirror.